From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. The Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions is located on the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As settlers and visitors, we feel it's important to acknowledge the traditional custodianship of these lands, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations, to work towards healing the wounds of colonialism, and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Miigwech.
Bonjour tout le monde. I hope you're doing well. I'm Linda Silas, National President for the Canadian Federation of Nurses Union, and I'm here in Ottawa today, and I have to say it's pretty cold for May 21st, but we're going to warm up at least the next hour with Rose when I introduce her in a minute. But I want to say, as we say to all our Facebook live event, this event is in English only. We have to figure out how to get the translation on this. But if you have any questions in French or English, please put them in the chat and I will make sure we get you an answer. Un gros bonjour à tout le monde, juste pour vous rappeler que cette session est en anglais seulement. Et si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas, placez-les dans la chat et je me ferai un plaisir de vous les répondre. So we will start. CFNU has been working towards building a trusted advocacy role for Indigenous people. It's a long process. Was it started with the TRC or much later than that? It was all a process for us of learning our history and acknowledging that many wrongs have been done. And as a healthcare organization, we have to advocate for ourselves. That's a big role of a union, but also advocate for others and making sure that equity, fairness is brought into our workplaces and brought to our healthcare system. And for us as individuals, but as the organization, we have a responsibility to uphold reconciliation and safety for Indigenous people in our care. It is not acceptable that Indigenous people continue to face racism when looking for healthcare today, and it is not acceptable for our Indigenous nurses still experiences racism in our healthcare workplaces. So on behalf of 250,000 members of the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, we are moving forward with reconciliation, first with an apologies for our historical lack of action, apologies for the current risks of racism faced by Indigenous people and our members who are of Indigenous heritage. We will share our apologies on June 3rd in Niagara Falls, where we will held our convention, and we will start this. The best way we can do is apologize with humility and willingness to learn more and to do better. As you know, an apology is meaningless without action. So on June 6th, which will be the last day of our convention, we will bring a pledge, we will bring an action of a resolution to do better. And this will identify specific tasks that will be approved by your board of directors, but also will be voted at our convention. So the 1,200 nurses that will be there will take a pledge to work forward on reconciliation and be accountable to the Indigenous people and to our own members. So in that spirit, we've invited Rose LeMay to come and give us a bit of history, a bit of learning why it is important for CFNU and other organizations to uphold the TRC, to work on reconciliation and how we move forward. And I'll always be a recognition and appreciative of Rose, but also our advisory committee. CFNU created a pan-Canadian advisory committee from nurses working in every nation. Even non-nurses were joining us to help us through this process, but to make sure we have the proper words and we have the proper actions to it and the process. So I'm excited to have Rose right here. And where's Rose? Can Rose come up on screen? So
Hi,
Rose,
Linda.
hi. So Rose is from Tlingit, which is out in the West Coast. She's with me in Ottawa, not with me, but she's also right now in Ottawa. And she's the CEO of Indigenous Reconciliation Group. She has over 20 years of experience of policy and program development in health and mental health development for government and nonprofit. She's just released a book. I said I'm now, I was a big fan of Rose before, and I always tease every Indigenous, non-Indigenous leaders working in this field. When I mention her name, they say, "Oh, yes, I know Rose, of course." And now she has a book, Allies is a Verb. I teased her when we first hooked on. I didn't have any stickers, but almost every page is full with quotes that I need to reread to go through my own journey on how to be an ally, how to learn about the history. So recommend that book. We'll put the link in the chat. So on behalf of Canada's Nurses, Rose, I welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Linda. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody across from coast to coast to coast. I am honored to be here with you. I want to talk to you about three things today, and I'll take about 30 minutes to do it. And then I'm really interested in any questions or comments from you. So please continue to put your thoughts in the chat. I want to talk to you about three things around the responsibilities of nursing and you as nurses to reconciliation. One of them is no history. The second is to contribute, do something for reconciliation in your workplace this year. And the third is to stop racism against Indigenous peoples. If we see it, we need to find ways to stop it. And I know I came out pretty strong there, and I'm going to go into each of these 3 points over the course of the next few minutes. And yes, I am going to be fairly direct about it. I believe that reconciliation is a bit around change management. What I know about change management is we actually have to name the problem in order to build consensus if there is a problem, come up with a solution, and also build your consensus that you want to be part of that solution. And so part of this is talking about some of the things that have gone wrong in history, some of the things that we can improve on today for Indigenous well-being. So let me get started. I come from Taco River Tlingit First Nations in northern BC. So shout out to everybody from BC. This is Atlan Lake, which is right next to our community. My mom comes from this community. This community. My dad's side, I come from Carcross, which is another Tlingit community just into the Yukon. And I want to talk to you a little bit about history. So an interesting thing about Carcross. You may or not remember one part of Canada's history, the Klondike Gold Rush. So going way back in history, and I apologize, I have a bit of a cold, so I may be coughing a bit. In the late 1800s, there was a gold rush. There was gold found in the Yukon. And all sorts of people came up by boat. They landed in Skagway, Alaska. They came up over the mountains and tried to find gold, trying to get rich quick. Canada's history textbooks tells a story that it was a white explorer, a white gold rusher, if there was such a title, that found the gold. And about 30 years ago, they started to shift. It's like, okay, so maybe it wasn't the explorer, the gold rusher who found it. Maybe it was a First Nations guy who found it from Carcross. But it was only through that strong advocacy and communication and resistance of Carcross First Nation that the story's actually been corrected. It was my great aunt, Shawclaw, who found the gold. It was found by a woman. History is a bit weird, and the way that it's told in this country has not always included the perspectives of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. May have actually completely left them out. When we don't know enough about Canada's history, we might not see the urgency for reconciliation, which is why history is so important to know. The more that you know about history, the more that you will see the need for reconciliation. It's that clear. Now, I'm feeling old today. It's cold. I have a cold. It's cold outside. So when I say this, I'm trying not to laugh out loud. But if you're as old as me, what you learned in school, in your grade school, probably wasn't close to the truth. It had some truths in it, but we need to expand that history to cover what happened for Indigenous peoples. So for Indigenous nurses in the room, this is your warning. I'm going to start talking about history. This is also part of our history. This is the Carcross Residential School. There were hundreds of residential schools across this country, and I'm sure that you know this history. It was a forced institution. We actually called them prisons. We didn't call them schools. And they were set up in order to quote the Prime Minister of the day, to kill the Indian and the child. By the way, don't use that word Indian. That is an offensive term now. The intent of these things was not good. There was no good intent about them. And children died. Children died of neglect, malnutrition, disease, and no health care was provided to these kids. We often talk about residential schools as if it's with this hidden thing. I'm not entirely sure they were hidden, even when they were in their height of operation, 1940s, 1950s. I think we knew about them. I think we just didn't talk about them. Carcross, as many communities, has done a search for unmarked graves, and unmarked graves were found. These schools were racially segregated schools. They were for Indigenous kids only. They weren't meant to educate. They were meant to train laborers for settler families. And they were based in this level, this kind of racism. And you're going to hear me talk about racism across history in this country. There's really no way to refute it. They were based in a belief that Indigenous peoples could never lead this country, could never work as a nurse, could never make decisions as an adult. And so these schools were meant to train as laborers. As healthcare providers, why is this important? On the very rare times in which healthcare might have gone into these schools, and it was rare, kids weren't treated. They might have instead been segregated away from healthcare. You will, excuse me, have First Nations and Inuit and Métis who come into your healthcare centers today who might actually be survivors of residential schools. And they might carry a fear around even the scrubs, your uniform. They might fear a time when they weren't listened to. It's important to know history because we as Indigenous peoples remember it, and we will hope that you remember it. The more you know about history, the more it might explain some of the things that are happening now. I do also want to talk about residential schools because it's really what led to the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. After a long period of trying to be heard for decades, from about 1980s through the 1990s, we finally got to a point in this country of being able to talk about residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was struck, and they put out their 94 calls to action in 2015. So in a nutshell, the TRC is about trying to right the wrongs of residential schools. Keep in mind, the TRC has calls to action specifically for you as nurses to do. It is your responsibility to fulfill them. I often wonder, though, did we actually enter into an era of reconciliation in 2015? And I'd say no. I don't think we had enough conversation across the country until 2021. You may recognize this picture. This is in Kamloops, the day of the announcement of the 2015. And media had all covered it in this day in 2021, how there was a search for unmarked graves at this huge residential school. And the unmarked graves, potentially of 2015 children, were found. That really hit hard for me that day But I think it also hit the country hard. You remember the flags were at half-mast all summer. Canadians put baby shoes on church steps. It was really the day in which the need for reconciliation became very clear. We couldn't deny it anymore. 2021. I think that was a day in which Canadians, we couldn't look away anymore. We couldn't deny it. It's important to know history because it's happening actually all around us. That's pretty recent. The last residential school closed in 1990s. It's pretty recent. So I do want to make an assumption here, and I'm going to tell you up front what my assumption is. My assumption is that you as nurses working on the front lines of healthcare, you've been through a really rough time. I get it. And I think then you can find the compassion to treat Indigenous peoples with excellence. We might have different requests. We might have different cultural safety needs. And my request of you is to then think about what they might be and do your learning to meet our needs. One of them might be how you choose to give culturally competent care to overcome, quite honestly, the fear I might have to go into a hospital at this point. I experience racism pretty regularly in healthcare. I want to feel safe. I want to feel heard. I want to feel respected, as does every single patient who comes into your clinic, your long-term care, your mental health institution, wherever you may work. So I am asking you to learn more to do even better for Indigenous clients. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about 4 things I ask of all allies. I'm only going to touch on 2 of them today. So the 4 things are to know more about history. The more we learn about history, well, actually, it's to do no harm. There are still residential school deniers in Canada who are truly harming Indigenous peoples simply by their denial. But really, the more you know about history, the more you understand the need for reconciliation, the need to do things in healthcare differently. It also helps, perhaps, the more you know about history, to see the immense strength of Indigenous peoples, the immense strength. Indigenous peoples are incredibly strong, and if you can see the strength first, that will really help. The more you know about history. And the second thing I'm going to ask you is to have the courage to see racism against Indigenous peoples. We are the most at risk in this country for racism, from getting killed in the hands of police, to being arrested, being in corrections, to being followed around in retail stores and in healthcare settings. These stats are all available. I'm not exaggerating this at all. And so there is a role for every healthcare provider to find ways to create safety for Indigenous peoples. These are the only 2 things I'm going to talk about today. The next 2 things are in the book. Hope you can buy a book. Is to learn more about your culturally competent care, how that works out in a daily practice, and then how to be a real actor to make significant change in healthcare systems. How we change systems is how we do reconciliation. But I want to just focus and come back to 2 more things in history and healthcare that are pretty important to know. You know, we just went through a terrible epidemic of COVID. And I don't think that we truly understood what an epidemic was in the wider healthcare setting until COVID happened. It was something we read about in textbooks, and it seemed just completely it just seems like something from the past, right? Indigenous peoples do remember epidemics because they happened quite recently for us, and they were devastating. From about the 1830s through to 1920s, Indigenous peoples across Canada endured an epidemic in one part or another of the country about every 20 to 30 years. So I want to share this one story with you. Smallpox. It's about smallpox. Terrible, terrible disease. This is a picture of the Songhees First Nation on the west coast near Victoria. Picture is from, I think, 1858. The painting, 1857. Pretty close to Victoria, which was the seat of the new colonial government of British Columbia. When smallpox and when, by the way, every single epidemic rolled across First Nations or Inuit or Métis communities, health care was withheld. It was not given at all. It was used instead as a controlling factor to try and get the land of First Nations and Inuit people and Métis people. That is the earliest memories of health care that Indigenous peoples might have, is that it was actually withheld. In Victoria, there's been a lot of research, and you can Google this and find this. When smallpox hit, the early colonial government leaders in Victoria debated whether or not to provide health care to First Nations. They could literally look across the water and see First Nations communities across the inlets, and they said, no, we're not going to give them health care. Smallpox had a devastating impact on BC First Nations on the West Coast. Up to 50% of people within communities died, perhaps even higher. And that is, unfortunately, the legacy of healthcare in this country, is how it was withheld as a political factor against Indigenous peoples. It was withheld in residential schools. It was withheld in times of epidemics such as this. And I wonder how we get over that. The way we get through, well, I'm not sure we get over it. We get through it by talking about it. So that's all of our history. It's not just a history of First Nations, it's all of our history, especially in healthcare. There's one more story I just want to talk about quickly, and that is, unfortunately, around Indian hospitals. And you also need to know this, because it's about racism, unfortunately. The withholding of healthcare, pretty racist. Indian hospitals also built as a policy built on racism too. This is going to sound pretty harsh, so let me just spit it out, then we can get it over with. Racism underpinned so many decisions around how healthcare was given or not to Indigenous peoples from the beginnings of this country. In the 1940s or so, Indian hospitals were started. They were racially segregated hospitals just for Indians. Again, the word I request, please do not use this word. There was about 29 set up all across the country. We haven't yet heard the stories, all the stories coming out of these institutions, but I would like you to prepare yourselves that this thing, Indian hospitals, the stories coming out are going to be as bad as they were about residential schools. In the same way that residential schools were not meant to educate, Indian hospitals were probably not meant to care for Indigenous peoples. We know of medical experimentation, of food experiments, of vitamin experiments, and they were non-consensual. The kids might not even have known. Parents definitely didn't even know this was going on. And there was abuse. There were locked rooms in these Indian hospitals. Care that was given was substandard. It wouldn't have met standards of the day, much less now. And nurses were there and were complicit. This is a story about the legacy of healthcare in this country. And why is this important to know? You may treat Indigenous patients and their families today who have been in these Indian hospitals. The last one, these Indian hospitals only ended in the 1980s. And when these Indigenous peoples come into your care, they will remember times in which healthcare providers didn't listen to them, did not uphold their rights, perhaps even abused them. And while you may not have worked in these Indian hospitals, and while it wasn't your fault, you bear the responsibility as a profession to ensure it never happens again. And that's what reconciliation is about. Reconciliation is about bearing the responsibility to ensure it never happens again. And the way in which we get there is it starts with apology. An apology is very much like ceremony. It will be a solemn event, and it may be unique. You may not have been in anything like this before. There has been numerous apologies in this country. Canada obviously apologized for residential schools in 2008. The federal government has also apologized for numerous other atrocities done to Indigenous peoples, from the forcible relocations of First Nations communities in Northern Ontario and Quebec, to the slaughter of sled dogs for Inuit communities across the north, to the forced relocations of Inuit for tuberculosis. Whole different story. If you've not heard about these stories, then do your research, learn more about them, because they are incredibly important in the history of our country. The Canadian Medical Association apologized for its role in all of this in healthcare last September, and now CFNU will apologize. And it will have impact for you in the room. It will have impact for those of you who are watching online, not only on the day of, but how you choose to move forward as nurses in upholding your care for Indigenous peoples. So I want to talk about two more things, and we're going to go to questions and comments. One is, what will it be like to be in the room and bear witness to an apology? So witness is not, I'm not using the word witness in a legal sense. I'm using it in the sense of how I'm taught in the West Coast from a First Nations perspective. When something really important happens, a marriage, some ceremonies in longhouses, there's actually people who are named as witnesses. And their role is to ensure that everything that they see, if they're ever asked about it, that they can describe what happened accurately to witness. An apology might hit differently for everybody in the room. But I do want to talk about how it may be experienced by your Indigenous peers who are in the room with you. Please don't make assumptions about Indigenous nurses who might be in the room in Niagara on that day, who might be watching online with you. Please don't make assumptions. You don't know if their family was in an Indian hospital at any time. You don't know if they're a survivor of residential schools. You don't know. Well, hopefully you do know. Hopefully you're asking. Hopefully you have the type of relationship, a trusting relationship, that you know about their history. But if you don't make assumption. There are two things that you can safely make assumption. Here, I'm going to then say the opposite right away. There's two things. One, assume that you won't know the depth of impact on them as First Nations, as Inuit, as Métis, to hear that apology. It will hit differently for Indigenous peoples in the room. If you know Indigenous peoples, if you're with Indigenous peoples, if you're standing next to them, ask if you could offer support. And they could say no. They could say no. We can always say no. Stand quietly beside them. Be there for them. Those are ways that you get to show support for the Indigenous peoples that you work with, who might be with you on the day of the apology. And you may be wondering, why am I talking about this so much? I'm talking about this so much because now I haven't talked to all Indigenous nurses, so this is a bit of an assumption on my part. I could be wrong. Every Indigenous nurse that I have talked to has witnessed and or experienced racism in their career very recently. They may have experienced racism themselves as employees. They may have seen racism perpetuated against Indigenous patients coming into their healthcare centers. And so when an apology is given for racism, it is given to them as well. I don't want to talk about racism as if it's such a big problem that is beyond anybody's reach, that is so big that we can't do anything about it. Because when we don't talk about it, we don't act on it. We do need to name the problem in order to move forward. We do need to name what it looks like, and also to talk about what it would look like to be free of racism. I stereotypically look First Nations. I'm assumed to be First Nations wherever I go. I'm more at risk of racism. I experience it probably monthly. I'm going to tell you this one last story. There was one time when I was in a hospital that I didn't experience racism. And you're saying, oh, wow, one time. Yes, actually, once. I wasn't, my pain wasn't dismissed. I was treated with respect. I was treated quickly. And I walked away from that moment thinking, wow, I want to be treated like that every time I have to go into a healthcare center, be it for me or for my kids or my grandkids. I don't think that's too much to ask. I have a human right, as does every single Indigenous patient, every single Indigenous person in this country, to be free of discrimination. That puts a responsibility on you to think about what are your roles as nurses, as advocates for your patients, to act for reconciliation. I can't give you all those answers. This is a learning journey to continue, but I know one of them is to stand up against racism in the healthcare centers. If you see it, do something. Be the advocate for First Nations and Inuit and Métis peoples that we want you to be. Uphold allies across your workplaces who are doing that job and show them your gratitude. Challenge racism. There's some kids on the screen that just give me hope. There's an Inuk child and some First Nations and their powwow regalia. These are the kids that are going to be growing up and coming into healthcare soon. And as long as with you, I hope that we all find ways to build that culturally safe workplace, culturally safe hospitals, so that we really are doing reconciliation on a day-to-day basis. So I want to talk to you a little bit about knowing history. I covered a few points. I asked you to do a little bit more research, continue your learning journey. I asked you to do some more work around what you could do for reconciliation. I didn't give you a lot of clues. Talk to your peers. Talk to people at Niagara. What are people doing for reconciliation? Start building up your ideas and your plan. And finally, I asked you to step in and challenge racism. Those are big asks. But as nurses, you are called to uphold the TRC calls to action. And so I'm simply repeating those TRC's calls to action. I really want to thank you for listening. And we're going to go to any questions or comments or thoughts now. I want to thank CFNU for giving the opportunity. Thanks to Linda for all of this work that I'm an honor to do with you. And I hope there's some questions and comments.
Give me a sec there. Thank you so much, Rose. There's one thing I've learned, many things, but the key one thing that I've learned going through this process of an apology is learning your history. And, I'm a little bit spicier than you. I started my career in nursing in the 1980s. And when I think that one of those awful last hospitals were during that time where I was practicing nursing, when I think of, I'm from Dalhousie, New Brunswick, the North Shore of the North Shore, and we were right next to the Eel River Bar Crossing Indigenous community. We went to school. I would have never thought there was any racism, but, flashback 30, 40 years after, I never saw any culture in that community. Probably within their home, they had the powwows, they had the dance, they had the beautiful ribbon skirts and all that. And today, every summer that I go home, I can go to a powwow. I can see the pride in their history and their culture. And it tells me there was racism, even as a young child, I couldn't experience it or couldn't see it. So it is so important. And you also repeated it often. Don't be performative, Linda. You need to be a vocal ally. When you see racism, you have to speak out. So I think we hear that very well. For those of you who are lucky enough to attend our convention, as Rose mentioned, the apology will be on June 3rd, early morning, and we're starting with a sunrise ceremony, and then 8:30 Eastern time it will start. We're working with the elders to make sure that we can put everything on stream, so everything on Facebook Live. If we can't, we'll respect the wish of the elders and we'll let you know then. But right after that, on June 6th, the Friday morning, again, around 8:30, 9 o'clock, will be the pledge. Again, there we're hoping that everything will be able to streamline. So as Rose said, it won't not only be about the nurses in the room, our Indigenous allied in the room that will be able to share it with us, but you'll be able to view it too. And my phone, for those of you who know how this works, I get the questions that you write down in the chat on my phone because I have magicians in the back. Oh my God, there's a lot of questions already. Okay. Oh, and I forgot, I can't forget, but we also commissioned Dr. Lisa Berg Bearskin from Victoria with her team of Indigenous nurse researchers across Canada build a paper for us, a storytelling paper, and we will be launching that at the convention. And again, key there is to learn the history, to learn our role, and sadly, our role still exists today. Rose talked about her great grandmother in the gold rush, but it is happening today, and we need to realize that. So let me look at questions here. So I have Wendy who says, "Thank you for the challenge to do my research. Will you give me some ideas on where to start?"
Sure. Thanks, Wendy, for your question. Here's a good short piece around history, and it's titled, "How Did We Get Here?" How did we get here? A concise, unvarnished account of the history of the relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada. It was co-written by two senators. I have a link to it on my website if you want to go to my website. There's some reconciliation resources there. That's a good place to start about history. For those of you who want to delve into history and healthcare, this is going to be a hard read. I'm not going to gloss that over. There's a book called Separate Beds by author Lux, Lux, and it talks a little bit around, it talks in depth actually around the segregation of healthcare. So there's two resources. One is a bit of a shorter, probably an easier read. The other one goes quite into depth. So there's a couple of resources to start with.
Thank you. And of course, I'll plug again her book.
Yes.
And if you're coming to convention, and her book, like, you think she was a high school teacher, because you read a page, you think, okay, I'm done. And then she gives you homework in her book. And then you read another chapter, you think, I'm done. And there's more homework, but a lot of references are in here. So if you're going to convention, you'll be lucky enough. CFNU will be gifting every delegate a copy of the book, again, to start that process. But I have a question for Molly. So is there anything we should do to prepare for the apology?
You know what? I would suggest, here's a couple things. Number one, learn how to answer the question, where are you from? It's a coded question. When a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis ask you that question, what they're really asking is, where are you historically and culturally from? Are you a settler with German descent or English descent, been here for 4 generations? Do you know where you are right now in terms of traditional lands that you live on right now? That's what we're looking for when we ask the question, where are you from? It is a coded question in which we ask in order to try and quickly gauge, are you on a reconciliation path? Are you learning this from Indigenous perspective? A second thing, here's another thing you could do. Do some quick research to find out what Indigenous health centers are around you, wherever you live. What do you know about them? What are they doing well? So here's two things you can prepare before you come to the apology.
Thank you. So Rachel asked, do you have any good historical accurate recommendation of studies that hold perspective of Indigenous people versus colonial history records? So I guess compares the two.
Well, the secret in this is to look for material that's written by Indigenous authors. It's incredibly important. The time in which non-Indigenous writers can write about Indigenous wellness, long gone, long gone. So look for Indigenous authors. Look for anything written by Carol Hopkins. She's First Nations from Southern Ontario, works primarily in mental health, amazing writer around some of the traditional ways that First Nations have thought about mental wellness and holistic well-being. So look for Indigenous authors, and you'll learn more about different ways to think about even healthcare. West Coast First Nations, I'm not sure how many First Nations even have a word for health separate from well-being. And so there's some fundamental differences when we start talking about Indigenous ways of being well and balanced compared to healthcare. But you only start to see those differences when you start to read and listen to Indigenous leaders in health and well-being.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Bisco is asking, as a First Nation healthcare provider, how do we handle racism directed at us from our peers and colleagues?
That's a hard one, and I feel for you if this is based on experience. I have taught anti-racism courses from coast to coast to coast. And every time I teach this, I talk to Indigenous peoples in the room and tell you, this is one of the hardest things we ever do. It is a type of harassment. And unfortunately, there is almost a repetitive trauma that goes on with it. And I don't mean to call it, well, maybe it is a trauma. It's up to you to define whether it is or not. But the repetitive nature of it, if as an Indigenous person, you experience it numerous times, the impact gets larger. It's up to you how you want to decide to respond. It totally is up to you. I hope that if you're the victim of racism in the workplace, that your allies immediately step in, that they don't leave it up to you to respond, because it's so difficult. I mean, I teach anti-racism, but I find it really difficult to respond, mostly because I get gaslit, right? This is really the role for allies. So for all of you who are non-Indigenous in the room, especially for those of you who are white, I'm going to use that word straight up. If you see your Indigenous peers experiencing racism, this is absolutely your role to step in, because people will listen to you. All you need to say is, what is going on here? Are you okay? And everything will stop. Or I say that, what's going on here, I will get gaslit. Talk to your union stewards. Racism is a harassment issue. You need to be protected for it, but against it. Talk to your employer. They need to have a racism policy in place, that there is discipline in place, because this can't continue. It's harassment. I feel for you. Hang in there. You have a lot of people around you, I hope, that will support you.
Yeah, I'm hoping she or he is working into a unionized environment, and they can, as you say, go to their steward and push it up the ladder. And racism is such a big word, and as a white woman, you get scared by it. But there's one lesson I learned from you just recently. Mm-hmm. It's also a question of respect. Because some of you may know me, I'm hyper, I'm always on the go, always a word to say. And we were talking and you paused, and I was uncomfortable because I don't pause to breathe, I don't pause to eat. And you were explaining to me that within your culture, you pause, and it doesn't mean you have to speak all the time. And that was a big lesson for me to learn to, yes, listen, but allow that time, allow that pausing and respecting. So, I don't think I was being racist, but learning that different culture and that respect was very important to me to learn as an ally. But, I just thought I'd share that because, listen to me, I'm just rattling on again. I don't pause at all. Go back to your questions, Linda. Dorothy Ann, we are trying to incorporate Indigenous healers in our health home design, but we are lacking staff who are trained. Is there any place that does Indigenous healing training, primarily Mohawk and Cree in our area?
Well, it's a bit of a deep question, and a bit complicated. No, universities and colleges won't be teaching Indigenous healings. It's not their knowledge to teach. Where one learns that is in lodges, from elders. There are a whole bunch of Indigenous healthcare providers, including nurses, though, who might integrate and might combine Indigenous ways of healing along with mainstream scientific healing. And I guess a good way of finding how do we support them to continue to do so. Indigenous ways of healing, Indigenous healers are going to be working within their own code of conduct with other elders and a circle of support, because nobody ever does this work alone. And they will join when they feel it's safe. And so I encourage you to continue your learning journey to continue to build safety in everything you do, from Indigenous art in the walls to hiring more Indigenous staff, even receptionists, and hiring more Indigenous employees, all the way through to CEO and board members, because that's how Indigenous healers will see that you're on the path, and then they're more willing to contribute. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of things going on here. It's a complicated question.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you could talk. It's typing, but I don't have any other questions coming up. But if you could talk more about the Indigenous art, like I love jewelry, I love colors, so I love the Indigenous art, and I was for years worried of wearing it because I'm not Indigenous. And how to be non-performative with it, but still respect and support the culture, either jewelry or paintings, or we had a question at our for our apology. Some of our white nurses that were gifted ribbon skirts, should they wear it? The answer was maybe not for the apology. You don't want to be too performative. Maybe if you can elaborate on that.
Sure. I can try. I think there probably are different perspectives of what is a cultural appropriation across the country. I think there actually are regional variations, because we don't all have, as First Nations and Inuit and Métis, all 750 communities, we don't all have the same approach. We have diversity. If you've purchased it, for sure, wear it. If you've purchased jewelry made by First Nations artists, absolutely. If you've purchased Inuit clothing that's made by an Inuit artist, absolutely. If it's a gift, it might actually have different meaning, and it might be something you only want to wear locally in ceremony. If you have a question, ask the person who made it. If you can, go back to the artist and say that I'm thinking about this, would it be okay? And they'll let you know. But generally, if you've purchased it, then it's something that the artist wants you to wear and to show others, so that people buy more of it.
Oh, I'm good at purchasing. That's for sure. And I'm good at purchasing local stuff, which I love. So it's all good. Um, Checking here. No questions. No more questions. So
Would you mind if I just checked in with April, who has one question?
yes, for sure.
April asked, I'm wondering if this Indigenous history has been presented, the stuff that as such has been presented here is considered to be part of a student nurse's education. Going forward, perhaps being incorporated into staff education sessions. April, it's a really good question. Interesting thing. It depends on where you're located, how much Indigenous knowledges has been incorporated into healthcare professional curriculums. Some places have done more than others. BC is doing quite well in K-12, is starting to incorporate it now into healthcare education curriculums. Other provinces and territories might not be doing as well. There are places that do it online. You've heard of Sanyas for BC. I have to also say that so do I. I have online courses. Online courses in education, the student curriculum and nursing curriculum has to go along with the policies by your employer. And so as we do reconciliation, we need to continuously be learning and implementing. And some people are moving faster than others. Perhaps nurses are moving faster than others. And that's just the way it's going to be. There's going to be periods of awkward in which we're trying to make change, even though we're still learning. I want to encourage you, especially if you're a student nurse, to be okay with in that place of learning and doing. We rarely, as adults, know everything. And in fact, if you tell me that you know everything, I'm probably going to call BS on you. So be okay with knowing enough to start acting now.
We did get another question from Christina asking, do you have any resources to recommend to help nurses to better support our Indigenous nursing colleague and reduce the risk of burdening them with the responsibility of teaching us the history and the impact of racism against Indigenous people in healthcare? And this is in the spirit of her wanting to learn more deeply, but she's always concerned about placing a burden on her Indigenous colleagues.
That's a really good question. Thank you, Christina. As a First Nations woman, I know it's my choice how I choose to speak around the racism I experience. There are days in which I choose not to speak about my personal stories for two reasons. Number one, I shouldn't be the story. The facts should stand on their own. One shouldn't need to hear about my personal experiences of racism in order to make change in the system. And I also know it kind of hits home if I tell the story. But I have to be in a good place to be able to share that story. If I'm sharing that story because I'm still angry and I'm lashing out, then you're probably not going to learn. All to say, I've chosen to do this work. Your Indigenous peers may not have chosen to do the work of anti-racism, and sometimes they get forced into it. They need to have a real choice whether or not they want to play that role or not. And they get to say no. They absolutely get to say no. You need to ask them, would it be okay if I asked you about, fill in the term here, heavy topic, racism, res schools? Make sure you always ask and be okay if they say no. No, not today. No, period. Not all of us want to do it.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. And it's all about a timing question. I think of my dear friend and femter, Tanya Dick, who's probably listening and thinking, Linda, stop talking about me. But when we met close to 15 years ago, none of us were talking about Indigenous health within healthcare. We were talking about the Jordan Principle. Nurses were really embedded into the Jordan Principle. It was affecting children, but it was affecting our members to a very, but the racism in the workplace. And Tanya stood at one of our conference and told her story. And since that day, that was about 2007, since that day, she's acted as a femtor to me. But there's days where she would say, Linda, I have enough. Like,
Mhm.
go find your own answer. And again, it's a question of respect and appreciation. Saying that, I taught her how to write a grievance and all that too. So, there was a good sharing here. But it is to find that friend, that mentor that can tell you outright, like you told me, Rose, Linda, pause, listen, and you have to accept it. Well, let me check this. Okay. No, I think we're getting to a close, Rose. I thank you so much again for all the work you've done with the Ontario Nurses Association, one of our biggest affiliate. That's how we got to know you, and the work you're doing with our team here at CFNU. And again, the advisory committee. We only see them here and there. But it is so important to get that fresh eye from across the country and to be able to choose the proper wording. And hopefully we'll make them very proud on June 3rd and June 6th. And not only that, it's the work that continued. You'll see on June 6th, our pledge to do better will compose of a work plan that we will present at the next convention in Saskatoon in 2027. It is a journey. It is a long term. You can't change history yesterday. You can't change history in a day. But one thing you reminded us is know your history, do something about it, and stop racism. And it's if you see it, say something about it. That's being an ally that's vocal. It's not just being an ally by wearing a button, and it's quite important. So thank you to all of you who have listened, who spent the last hour. We're at 57, last hour with us. Please share the link to all your friends. This will be more information going to our delegates at convention, but to our general membership. There's 250,000 practicing nurses in our organization that need to hear these stories and need to do better and to be better allies. And we'll work on that. So that I'm committed to do, and I'm proud to be president of CFNU that's moving on this agenda. So I thank you, merci, miigwech, and see you at the next one, which will be on June 3rd. Gros merci.